I'm Sarah Zatko, as he said. I'm the chief scientist at the Cyber Independent Testing Lab, and this talk is about the highlights from our last year's worth of research and the introduction to what the work we're doing with consumer reports and how that can apply to you right now. Right, so the first question is, for those who don't know, what is CITL? Because we're still relatively low profile. We are a nonprofit research organization focused on being sort of a consumer reports for specifically software risk and safety. Some people get confused and think that means we're just evaluating security software, but no, we're evaluating all kinds of software, IoT and desktop, whatever things have binaries. And we're looking at how well built is it, how well did they implement security and safety functions. So, you know, what application armoring features does it have and how well are they implemented, what functions were linked to, what libraries and what were their safety features, complexity, etc. That's the sort of thing we're looking at, because all of those directly lead to the question of how exploitable is this? How difficult is it to newly exploit a piece of software? You know, because that all comes down to build quality and how much did the development team give a shit about security when they put it together. So what we're doing long term is developing tests for software and then publishing those for the public. Where we are right now with that is that we've developed the tests for evaluating all of the and measuring all the things we want to measure on a binary. So now we're working on scaling it up and figuring out our reporting and scoring mechanisms and developing our relationships with people who are better equipped to publish reports and results than we are. You know, people like consumer reports, because we don't want to get into the publishing game. That's not an extra hat that I want to wear. So the end goal is a safer, better software marketplace where people can be informed shoppers and make decisions that reduce the risk in their environments. And, you know, to be the nutritional facts for software, that if somebody cares about their diet, they can, you know, make sure they're not eating more junk food than they absolutely need. And somebody who doesn't care can just ignore it. That's, you know, the ultimate goal. Right now, we're in an interesting spot because we are very happy with our ability to measure all the things that we feel it's important to measure on a binary. And the next step, of course, would be to turn all those, you know, 100, 200 measurements per binary into a single number. You know, what score did this get? And we have scores right now, but it's hard to tell how many points any particular thing should be worth. You know, are stack guards worth 20 points out of 100, 15, 10? It's hard to say because there's no studies showing the overall efficacy of all these different safety features or the impact of bad development practices. You know, no one's ever said, here's 100 binaries with and without this safety feature, and here's how that changed fuzzing results. These sorts of fundamental studies would be taken for granted in most fields. You know, if you have something that you want to have adopted as a best practice, you have to show that it is a best practice. You have to show that it does what you said it should do and what the impact is and why it's something that should be required of, you know, vendors or whatever your industry equivalent is. But in the security field, we haven't been doing that. We come up with our bright idea, we publish why we think it's going to work, and other security professionals can understand our argument, but the people who are making the big decisions about what stuff's required or what they're going to buy, they can't tell the difference between a snake oil salesman and somebody with the real thing, because in both cases, all it comes down to is, I'm an expert, trust me, this works. So that data is what we're filling in right now. We want to make sure that our scores are solid and that we have the backing data to explain why somebody's score got dropped down so low due to their practices. And so that's what I'm really excited about right now, is that we have a lot of static analysis data, and now we're going to be building up a large corpus of fuzzing data to go with it so that we can do all the data science magic and show that all these things that we're requiring or penalizing in terms of score mechanisms, that all these things really do matter for overall exploitability. Not just from empirically, I've had an easier time exploiting something that didn't have this safety feature, but from a actual scientific data perspective. And so that data, when we've built up this corpus, is going to get shared, and that's the most exciting thing to be looking for in the coming year from us. Is a really nice corpus of data to dig your teeth into in terms of being able to prove that all the things that you think somebody should do actually matter. It's just one of those bizarre blind spots of our industry as it stands, that it doesn't already exist. And when we realized how many problems stem from it, we were like, oh, this is what we're going to spin up on right now, because we need this data and we're sure other people do too. So this talk is going to first focus on the really preliminary results from our fuzzing. As I said, we're ramping up our ability to automatedly fuzz binaries at scale so that we can build up that side of our corpus. And then for the highlights from our static analysis from the past year, we're going to look at some comparisons between different operating systems, a couple smart TVs, comparisons between browsers on the 3 major operating system environments, interesting case study about Microsoft Office for OS X, and then I'm going to talk about our work with consumer reports and the digital standard. So, fuzzing. To date, we've fuzzed about 300 binaries, which isn't nothing, but when you see that we've done our static analysis on over 100,000 binaries, it's not where we need it to be. We're looking to really ramp this up. And what we're developing is a fully automated system where we set up a VM, install the software to be tested, try out our various pre-existing fuzz harnesses on the binaries, see which ones seem to hook up okay. If we get something that works, then we fuzz it, then automated crash triage to identify primitives. And this is all using AFL variants and things from the Cyber Grand Challenge that we've customized to our fairly specific use case. Most people, when they're fuzzing, they want to hit a particular target usually, but what we want is just numbers and breadth. We want to fuzz as many varied binaries as possible. So, if something doesn't hook up right, we just skip it and move on to the next thing. And as I said, we've fuzzed about 300 binaries so far, about 200 with AFL, the straight up version, and then about 100 with the version of AFL that we're currently customizing for our own needs, which is creatively called CITL fuzz for now. Maybe we'll come up with a more clever name in the future. So for the stuff we fuzz with CITL fuzz, so far the most interesting thing to do is just look at, for packages where we fuzzed more than one binary, how did those packages do as a whole? And what you can see is that libcbin and cook did the best, because those were the largest numbers of binaries fuzzed without any crashes. 4 and 5 binaries is not hugely impressive, but still, those were the most stable packages so far, with Cana in third place, because they did have a handful of crashes, but still the best for the, is it an airplane taking off? Still the best for the number of binaries fuzzed. And then our big losers are ELF utils, BioSquid, and CDF tools. In particular, BioSquid has several hundred unique crashes per binary fuzzed, so that's pretty awful. But BioSquid and ELF utils both had a 100% crash rate for binaries fuzzed, and CDF tools was 81%. So those ones were the bottom of the barrel so far. For our data with AFL, we had static analysis collected at the same time, so we could do some really preliminary correlations between static features that we look for and numbers of unique crashes. In particular here, we're looking at how the counts for risky and bad functions correlate with the numbers of unique crashes. So exec LP and exec V have pretty high correlations with numbers of crashes, which, confirms our identification of it as a risky function. As we get more data and can get more sophisticated with our identification of primitives, this sort of analysis will get more exciting, and we'll be able to really fine-tune what functions belong in which categories. And, since some of that identification was a little bit empirical and, historically based, but not, as I said, database. That's what we're addressing. So that's it for the fuzzing data, which, as I said, was very early days. On to the main meat of the talk, the static analysis results. So first we're going to look at operating systems. For looking at an entire operating system, that's, several thousand, if not tens of thousands of binaries. So each one of those gets a single score. It would be awfully overwhelming to look at all of those numbers. But what we do is we create a bar chart, a histogram of how all those scores worked out. And I know the numbers are small, but what we have is the scores binned in fives from -10 up to 110. So for example, in that first chart, the biggest peak there shows that they had the most things in the 65 to 70 bin on Windows 10. And the y-axes are, so the x-axes in all these charts are the same. The y-axes are not, because it made things fairly unreadable given how much the number of binaries varies from one environment to another, and it didn't really, it wasn't very relevant to the story we're telling here. So, but for example, on that first Windows 10 chart, there's 5,500 binaries that fell into that 65 to 70 bin. And on each chart, we've called out the 5th, 50th, and 95th percentiles to give you a better idea of what the distribution is. What's interesting about Windows 10 is that the 5th percentile mark is so close to the 50th that they've cleaned up their lower tail, the low-hanging fruit, and pulled a lot of their softer targets up. As you might expect, low scores are bad, high scores are good. The further to the right you go, the harder the targets are. And the other interesting thing is how there's such high peaks, very focused in the Windows 10 chart. This is a sign of an organization that's making a concerted effort to be consistent in their security practices. When organizations don't make that effort, then it ends up being a much messier distribution without any really distinct high peaks like you see for the other two distributions. So when we move to OS X, El Capitan, the scores don't get significantly lower. They're, our percentile marks are mostly, the 90th, 5th moves down by 12 points, which, is not nothing, but not a huge deal. But you can see the distribution gets a lot messier. They've been a lot less consistent in their internal practices from one part of the OS to another. And the 5th percentile mark moved a lot further from the 50th. So their lower tail, the low-hanging fruit in their environment, there's a lot more stragglers. And then on Linux Ubuntu, the 5th percentile mark gets even further from the 50th, so it's a clear progression. And if you look at the cost for exploits from the most recent pwn to own, those match up pretty closely with the hierarchy I just pointed out. The Windows 10 exploits are the most expensive, and then the Linux ones are the cheapest. So, their assessment of difficulty to exploit based on actually trying to exploit things, and ours based on the sorts of static features we look for line up very closely. And it's a nice confirmation of our approach. More recently, we got some data on OSX Sierra. So it's interesting to see, comparing it to El Capitan, what, if anything, is improved. And so what we have here is number of binaries, the percent of those binaries that have various application armoring features like ASLR or stack guards or data execution prevention. What percent are 64-bit, what percent have various levels of source fortification, and then what percent have functions from our different categories. Good, bad, risky, and ick all mean exactly what you'd think they mean. ASLR was already pretty high, but it inched a little bit closer to 100%. The bit about heap depth and 64-bit is a little bit odd on OSX because in the most recent OSX compilers, if you compile a binary as 64-bit, it turns off the heap data execution prevention flag by default. So you'll see the increase in 64-bit is pretty much exactly the same as the decrease in data execution prevention on the heap. Some people would argue that this doesn't matter, but we are of a different opinion on that because depending on what environment you're in some cases it'll still enable heap data execution prevention by default, but in others it'll see that you have a flag indicating that you're not equipped to do that and it'll disable it. It depends on the local environment settings, so it's dangerous to have this flag be more and more missing from otherwise fairly well put together binaries. And on fortification, everything looks a little bit better on Sierra. The fortification numbers for partially and fully fortified stayed about the same, but a lot fewer unfortified. And eagle-eyed viewers will note that these three numbers don't add up to 100%. That's because if you don't include any of the functions that OSX can fortify, then we can't tell whether you enabled that flag or not. You know, it doesn't matter if there's nothing to fortify. And then for the function categories, bad and risky both dropped by a significant margin, about 10 points each. And good went from 8% to 25%. That's actually the biggest improvement across the board. So that one was actually really surprising. And so well done there. And then the last bit of data for OSX Sierra is a view of effects of corporate policies for employees when it comes to installing their own software. So what we have on this chart is the blue lines are the default build that employees at a particular 1,000-employee company get when they get their new OSX laptop, everything that's installed on that system. The tiny little gray bars in front of that you can probably hardly see are what executables from that system they run in the course of their work. And then the big orange bars in the back are all the executables that get run from that system after they get permission to install whatever they want. So the main thing to note here is the huge increase in attack surface between the live clean version, those gray bars, and the live dirty version, the orange bars. And obviously some of those things that got installed in the dirty installation were necessary, but probably not all of them. And it just speaks to the necessity of really considering your policies on things like this, especially as you start becoming a larger organization. And the other thing to note is how much further down the scores go on the orange distribution. The negative scores stop at -10 on the base install and the clean system, and they go down to -35 on the dirty system. So you're adding a lot of low-hanging fruit. And that in particular, an organization should look for. That if you just had something where you had a triage of what things you're going to require somebody sandbox or make some effort to isolate, you could make sure you're not adding such a long lower tail to your environment's risk profile. Our last set of operating systems we're going to look at for the next 2 slides are all Linux environments. This first one is the same Linux distribution that you saw earlier, and it's just the regular version you'd get off the shelf. The one below it is what you get when you take an off-the-shelf Linux distribution and make a small, modest effort to harden it. You take out the things you don't need, and you recompile everything with all the reasonable application armoring flags. It doesn't involve any code modification and is a totally reasonable effort to expect from any decent-sized vendor if they're putting together their own Linux distribution. Obviously, if people are familiar with the IoT world, then while we would love to see a distribution like this hardened one on real-world IoT products, we see something more like the 2 below. The third plot is from a Samsung Smart TV, and then the fourth one is from a LG Smart TV. And you can see they're not even looking like the off-the-shelf Linux, they're lower than that. They're missing some of the off-the-shelf application armoring features. They're smaller, the Samsung only has 4,000 binaries and the LG only has 2,000, but that's still a full-blown Linux environment. They could still have had those application armoring features. They just didn't because no one's looking. And these are really pretty common IoT environments. This is Tizen OS and WebOS. These are not obscure IoT environments. And as an example of what's possible in that sort of footprint, we can compare those to the Amazon AMIs that you get in their cloud computing environment. So these both have about 2,000 binaries, so they're very similar in size. But here, they were clearly put together by someone who cared about their security and risk profile. So where the previous ones had scores going well down into the negative numbers, here the lowest scores on these environments are 40 and 30 respectively. So, it's a significant improvement and a really nice view of what's possible in a similar sort of footprint. To see why those smart TVs did as poorly as they did, here we've got a table similar to the one that we had for the OS X comparison earlier. I've highlighted the bad numbers in orange and then really bad in red, just to point out which parts really contributed to these low scores. So, ASLR normally is close to 100% use these days, but not on these smart TVs. And their use of RELRO, a really basic exploit mitigation tool on Linux, was almost non-existent. And not nearly enough use of stack guards and source fortification on Samsung, almost none on LG. So, that's going to really hurt your final report. So that's it for operating system level views. Next up is applications. When we're looking at single applications, we then use that histogram as the context for understanding what a score means. If knowing that something got a 59 is all well and good, but knowing that that's below the 50th percentile mark on OS X provides very useful context for that. So for the browsers on OS X, Firefox did not terrifically. Safari was pretty middle of the pack, and Chrome did respectably, not amazing, but better than anything else. On Linux, this is Firefox's home turf, so they did much better. Here, I'm specifically pointing out the scores for the executables without any libraries taken into account, because you see an interesting effect when you bring libraries in. So without libraries, Chrome and Firefox got the same score. Granted, this is slightly due to the fact that we're still working on our sandboxing evaluations, and when we get full points in for sandboxing, Chrome probably gets a few more points than Firefox. But for now, they're scoring about the same. until you look at what libraries they're linking to, at which point Firefox falls 15 points behind Chrome. And this just speaks to the importance of caring about the security of the libraries you link to. When people are figuring out what libraries to use in their development of a product, they first consider functionality, what licenses are they using, but then, the very close third place should be how secure is this? Because while people tend to have a not my code, not my problem kind of attitude about libraries, it is code that your product is linking to and bringing into runtime when it's used. So, that matters. That will be reflected in your, permanent record. And then finally, Windows browsers. So we looked at Firefox, Chrome, and Edge. We also looked at IE, but it had basically the same score as Edge, so I took it off for readability. So here, again, Chrome would probably get a few points closer to Edge once we finished our sandboxing evaluation, but they were both very respectable scores. Edge, being on its home turf, did slightly better. And Firefox did pretty poorly again. And, their 64-bit was better, but it really doesn't count from our perspective, because if you went to the Firefox website and got their default download, it was the 32-bit. It actually took a little bit of hunting for me to find the 64-bit version to test, and your average consumer is not going to bother, especially since that default download wasn't explicitly labeled as 32-bit. It's just Firefox. So if somebody wasn't looking, they wouldn't even know. And again, looking at pwn values for exploits, they map pretty closely to the scores that we assigned. With Microsoft Edge and Chrome being the most expensive, Safari's middle of the pack, and Firefox is relatively cheap. The last bit of static analysis data that we're going to look at is Microsoft Office for OS X. We beat up a bit on Office 2011 last year, and we wanted to revisit it with Office 2016 because it speaks to an interesting story about upgrades and when they're worth the price. Particularly for Office software, I know that when a new package comes out, I'm not usually in a big rush to go get the new Office suite because all the features that I need I'm already using on my current suite, and I know they'll have moved a bunch of buttons on me and it'll take me a week before I'm productive in it again. Like, who needs that? But sometimes there are hidden features. So on OS X Office 2011, they had pretty abysmal scores. Microsoft was not operating in their home turf here, and it showed. And their auto update in particular had one of the worst scores we'd seen on that environment. And their average score for binaries in that suite was around 16, 17 points. So not a very strong showing at all. But Office 2016, they really cleaned up their act. Their average score improved by 60 points. And the Office auto update was one of the most improved, going from that 7 to a 64. So, if you're just looking at, oh, they moved the buttons on me, then it doesn't seem like it's worth it. But if you're, making a purchasing decision for your organization, this would be a reason to make everyone learn where those new buttons are. So that's it for our static analysis data. Now on to the work that we've been doing with consumer reports, which is really very exciting. They've put together a group of us and several other digital rights-focused organizations, ones that are focused on privacy and security and digital rights-related governance, data sharing, stuff like that. And what we've been doing is putting together our first draft for a testing standard you could use to evaluate digital rights profiles of products, be they straight up software products or IoT. And you can find that first draft at the website I have here. I'll show it again at the end. And if you go there and see anything you disagree with or quibbles about wording or anything like that, as I said, it's a first draft and we welcome your input. So everything there links to GitHub, and you can put your 2 cents in, or however many cents it is you have to give us. And so we've come up with this first draft, we've shared it for comment, and then we're proceeding to try and apply it to real-world verticals of products, including the smart TVs and browsers that you saw earlier in the talk. Other organizations also had to go at those same products. Until Consumer Reports decides to publish the whole report, I can only publish our part of it, the part I shared. But I'm looking forward to having those full reports go live whenever they decide to do that. And as time goes on, we're going to continue testing other product verticals so that we can work out the kinks in our testing procedures and figure out what has to change for different types of products. If you look at the digital standard, you'll see that we have multiple columns here. Things get more technical the further right you go. So the first column is just the name for a criteria. After that is the layperson understandable description of what that criteria is. Then after that, what indicators are we looking for in assessing that criteria? And then finally, a test procedure. If you look at the little icons by the criteria names, if it has a little green check mark, that means it's pretty fully baked at this point. One of the member groups of our little coalition has the capability to test this at scale already established. If it has a little orange-yellow flask, like that second one on the screen, that means that one of us knows how to test it, has that capability, but we don't think it scales very well, is usually what that means. That we're not sure that our current procedures are going to work for the sort of scale that Consumer Reports or any other watchdog group would operate at when they're trying to look at all the TVs. And then if it has a little red exclamation point, that means it's something we think is important, but that none of us have the in-house capability to evaluate it right now. So those are the things where we need the most work and where we welcome the most input. And you can see there the test procedure column is blank because, as I said, we don't have a test. So if you're interested in this work and interested in contributing it, we welcome all those quibbles about what word we used where and all that sort of thing. But what we'd really love to see is if you know how to turn any of those red and orange icons to little green check marks, and are interested in working with us, or you think you know how to do it and you need funding for a research thing, you can ask and we'll see if we can scrounge up some pocket change or, pennies from the couch or whatever. So this digital standard is going to improve as people pitch in and as we figure out how to turn those icons green ourselves or with help. And we're really looking forward to figuring out how to improve our ability to test products in a full view. Consumer Reports recognizes that the current procedures where they just test the functionality of products and the how good a TV is it and how do we like its features and how well does it work from a traditional product perspective is missing the smart part of smart TV. They want to be able to evaluate the software, and I'm really excited to work with them on figuring out how to do that. So CITL, our contact info is up top if you have any follow-up for me. And then if you have follow-up on the digital standard, the URL and contact info for them is down below. And thank you, and have a great end of your Black Hat.
All right. What is the plan for revisiting software? Because software is so dynamic. If Mozilla was to push out an update, is it like an annual plan or?
It depends on the release schedule for the product. I mean, we'll revisit major releases. We're not going to revisit every patch that comes out because usually a patch fixes a single bug. It doesn't fix the overall build quality of a device, or of a piece of software. So if it's something where it's a new major release, then we'll revisit. But that's part of why we're developing test procedures that are fully automated so that it's not a big lift for us to revisit things when they need to be.
Did you spend any time getting historical vulnerability data and comparing it against what your metrics were for software quality?
No, because that's something that would be a bit more labor intensive on our part. We're trying to focus on how we can get as much data as quickly as possible, so on automating things going forward. It's not to say it's not interesting. After we publish some of our data corpus, somebody else could work on that sort of thing. But it's not our focus right now. We've only got so many hours in the day.
When do you expect the Consumer Reports report to come out?
That is not my decision, so I have no idea. Nobody's shared a timetable with me. It depends on other people deciding they're comfortable enough with the results.
Yeah, sort of related to that, I went to your talk last year, and then I went up to your website, and it's like no information.
We're working on a redesign of the website and hiring somebody who's better at design to come up with some nice-looking interactive reports so that we can showcase some of our data. It just, we were more focused on developing the tests, and so going forward, we're going to be focusing on presenting results better.
I mean, if you could just have results in some of the major operating systems and some of the major applications like
Yep, but it's
Apache,
a two-person shop, and it isn't a minimal effort to get all of that up and presentable in a way we wouldn't be embarrassed of. So we're doing it as fast as we can.
Okay, so when do you think that would be available, at least some of that? I mean, at least major applications and operating systems?
I think I've answered this question already. Yeah, we're doing it as fast as we can.
As fast as you can.
Work, do you find a lot of new vulnerabilities that you report to the National Vulnerability Database?
No. In general, we're not actually looking for specific exploits. We're looking for overall quality and likelihood or difficulty to exploit. So the static analysis data that we get tells us that something is well built or not, or that it's likely to have certain types of exploits or not, but it doesn't tell us there's this kind of exploit on this line of the code. That's not, so there isn't anything to report. They know what they did from a security standpoint in terms of putting this thing together, and so that's not our job.
Thank you.
I have just one follow-up. Since you're not ready yet to release anything, can you at least tell us what tools you use so we can try to do our own internal assessments of major products?
Well, if you look at our website on the blog posts, we've been very thorough in detailing all the different types of things we're looking for in terms of application armoring features and function categories and things like that. Most of that's with in-house custom tools that we've developed. Right. We want to be very clear about what we're looking for and what improves somebody's score, but we're probably not going to share the specific code because we don't want to make it too easy for someone to make it look like they did the right thing instead of actually doing the right thing. It's tricky to open source your evaluation tools and not open yourself up to somebody doing whatever minimal effort is required to just trick the tool.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to convince our engineering staff to harden stuff that they're using instead of just pulling binaries off the internet and then deploying with it. So
right, and so that's why we're looking forward to publishing the data we're collecting right now, the corpus of static analysis and fuzzing data showing the correlations between good developer habits and good security practices, and then good fuzzing results. All right. And so that's the part we're focused on right now.
Okay, and will that be within a year, you think, or a couple of years, or?
I believe it will be within a year, but it's a research effort, so I can't give you a specific date.
Can we donate to speed things up, or?
You're always welcome to.
All right. Thanks.
Everyone good? Okay, great. Thank you for coming to my talk.